Well, happy Sabbath to everybody. It's an honor, once again, to be able to address everyone. I have an interesting subject today. The name of the sermon today I've titled as Dangerous Stories. And you probably can figure out that the most dangerous stories that we tell are the ones that we tell ourselves. The ones that we tell ourselves to justify what we're doing and to make sense of what we're thinking and whatnot. And so we're going to be stalking a particular biblical character through the Bible and asking the question is, what stories were they telling? What stories were they listening to? And then kind of applying that to ourselves. What stories do we tell ourselves to justify the things that we're thinking and doing? So before I kick off into stalking this particular character, I want to explain kind of how I became a student of cognitive psychology. If you turn over to Romans 7, and verse 14, a very, very familiar scripture. It says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For what I am doing, I do not understand. What I will to do, that I do not practice, but what I hate, that I do." So I know we've all looked at that, and although we might find some comfort there, saying, he's battling the same things I'm battling, we all want to kind of figure out why this works the way it does and what we can do to be better soldiers. So I was searching. I was searching for answers regarding this subject of why I don't do what I want to do, and I do those things that I don't want to do, and what is this carnal mind that I'm dealing with? And I ran across a guy named Lou Tice, and he had an institute that was international. It was called the Pacific Institute. And we kind of my company, and I got involved with them to try to solve some of our problems. And one of the guys there that became a really close friend, his name was Danny Akers, and his dad's name was Fred Akers. If you guys are college football fans, you may know who he was, but he was the coach of University of Texas and their football team. And they were involved with the Pacific Institute for the same reason I was, learning, how psychology works, how our mind works, and what we can do to break through our barriers, and instead of doing the things we don't want to do, to actually do the things we want to do. And instead of not doing, the things we, get on track, get what our intentions and our activities in line, because ultimately, brethren, that's the battle. That's the battle, is getting our good intentions in line with our good activities. So one of the things that Fred Akers taught me was that you look at where we are right now, what our thoughts are right now. You can look at our habits, our attitudes, our beliefs, and our expectations from like 6 months ago, and that will explain where we are right now and what we're doing. Habits, attitudes, beliefs, and expectations. Well, why do we believe the things that we believe? We take what we believe, our opinion of what is, and we call that the truth, right? But is it really the truth? Turn over to Jeremiah 17. Jeremiah 17, and you probably know exactly where I'm going, another memory scripture. Verse 9, Jeremiah 17 and verse 9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, Jehovah, search the heart. I test the mind even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doing. As a partridge that broods but does not hatch, so is he who gets riches, but not by right. It will leave him in the midst of his days, and at his end he will be a fool. So, brethren, we're dealing with a deceitful heart, a deceitful mind that's desperately wicked. How does all of this work? The way that it was explained to me, and what I learned is you can take our mind and you can break it up into the conscious mind, which is the dialogue, that's ongoing conversation that we're having with ourselves. That's our conscious mind. And then you have the subconscious mind, which stores a whole lot of information, but it also kind of runs the factory, makes your heart beat, and just keeps the factory running. But we have this other thing that's called the creative subconscious. Now, in actuality, our brain is not compartmentalized and, okay, there's a slice here that does this. It's like, a whole mess. It's like a cobbler, but these are kind of three functions. But what the creative subconscious mind does is it makes sure that our internal blueprint, the way that we think things ought to be, kind of matches with the outside world. And the way that it does that is through a part of the brain called the reticular activating system that filters out information, so that we build blind spots, scotomas, things that are right in front of us we can't see. Even though they're right there in front of us, we can't see them. One of the things that I was introduced to prove this point is a guy passed out a card, and he asked everybody to read the card. And the card said, finished files are the result of years of scientific study combined with the experience of years. So you read the card, and he said, okay, now set it down. So we set it down. He said, okay, pick it up and read it again. So finished files are the result of years of scientific study combined with the experience of years. Okay, put it back down. He said, okay, now pick the card up, and he said, read the number of the letter F's. Okay, so you go through and you're looking for the letter F's. And the consensus in the room was that there's 3 F's. You got finished files are the result of years of scientific study combined with the experience of years. So there's 3 F's. And he says, no, there's more than that. Look again. And so we look again. He said, no, there's 3 F's there. Somebody says, oh, I see 4. And no, there's more than that there. And so we kept working and kept reading over. And how do you find the F's? Well, it turns out there's 6 F's in that sentence. But there's 3 times uses the word of. Well, we pronounce of with a V, O-V. And so even though our eyes are seeing 6 F's, our mind is not seeing the F's. We're just seeing the one in scientific. We're seeing the other F's, but we miss 3 of the ofs, even though they're right in front of our face. And then we take our little cards and we take them home, and then we show them to our family, and we trick them, and then we show it to other people and we trick them. But the important thing to know is that you can be looking right at something and not see it. I've seen it over and over again. How many times have you said, I've lost my keys and I can't find them anywhere? And then, sure enough, you've sold yourself, and your keys can be right in front of you, and you can't find them because you can't find them anywhere. And then finally, 4th, 5th, 6th time, so I know they're here. Okay, well, then you said the magic words. I know they're here, and then all of a sudden you see them. They just, appear. I had an experience like that recently with I knew I had bought a bottle of a certain oil of oregano, couldn't find it, and couldn't find it anywhere, Well, where do you think I finally found it? Right where I knew it was, right at the very beginning. I just couldn't see it. So our reticular activating system is very strong. It's only going to let through things that we think are important or relevant. So there's this other a concept I want to introduce. It's called lock on, lock out. And the way I learned this is we were shown a card that has a picture of an old lady on it. But if you look at the picture a certain way, instead of the old lady, you see the young lady. And if you look at it another way, you see the young lady instead of the old lady. Well, so they passed the card out, and they're asking the question of okay, everybody's got a different card, obviously. Which card did you get? Did you get the one with the young lady, or did you get the one with the old lady? Well, you go around the room, and I got the young one, I got the old one. It's split about 50-50. But the fact is everybody had the same card. They just saw something different. So then it was a matter of take all the ones that have the old lady and show the ones that have the young lady, show them the old lady, show them what you're seeing. Well, this is what really got interesting, because no matter how hard we tried to get somebody to see what we were seeing, they couldn't see it because they were locked on to their first impression, their first picture. Once they saw that young lady, they were kind of locked on. Now, we could kind of break the pattern, but it took a lot of, probably 10 or 15 minutes of convincing people, no, it's really there, you can do it, look at this, here's the cheekbone, here's the nose. But what was amazing is to understand that when we lock on to something, our mind, our reticular activating system, locks out all the other options because we want to be right. We want everything, more than anything else, we want to be right. So our mind will block out things that prove us wrong. So now let's jump into stalking this biblical character through Scripture. And who we're going to be talking about is Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam, the guy that built the two calves in Dan and Bethel, and was the most evil person in the Bible, and he caused all Israel to sin, and it was, he's just a really bad guy. Well, that's the guy that we're going to track. But as we kind of track him through Scripture, let's kind of look at our own history, okay? There was a time when we didn't keep the Sabbath, or maybe a lot of us, some of us, not me, was born in the church and we've never not kept the Sabbath. But for some, they went to church on Sunday. And then all of a sudden they saw stuff they hadn't seen before, and now they understand about the Sabbath. For the Church of God, the Church of God kept the Feast of Pentecost on Monday for years and years and years, and couldn't see anything else. And then all of a sudden, some truth broke through the barrier, and then everybody keeps the Feast of Pentecost on Sunday. But the information to show when Pentecost was, it didn't just suddenly appear. It was always there. We just couldn't see it. So, brethren, turn to 1 Kings 11, verse 26. 1 Kings 11 and verse 26. It says, Then Solomon's servant Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zereda, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, he also rebelled against the king. And we're going to find out why in a little bit. And this is what caused him to rebel against the king. Solomon had built the Milo and repaired the damages to the city of David, his father. The man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and Solomon, seeing that the young man was industrious, made him the officer over the labor force of the house of Joseph. So we see here that Jeroboam was a young, natural-born leader that got things done, noticed by Solomon. But also notice that at the time that he was being elevated, who was his hero? Jeroboam's hero kind of would have been Solomon. So let's learn a little bit about Solomon. Let's go to 1 Kings 1 in verse 39. 1 Kings 1 and verse 39. It says, Then Zadok the priest took a horn of oil from the tabernacle and anointed Solomon. And they blew the horn, and all the people said, Long live King Solomon. Now, there was obviously a story that led up to that scene. Turn over to 1 Kings 3 and verse 3. 1 Kings 3 and verse 3. We read, And Solomon loved Jehovah, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. I kind of lock onto that. Solomon burned 1,000 offerings on that altar at Gibeon, because we're going to hook the dots a little bit later. At Gibeon, Jehovah appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask, what shall I give you? And Solomon said, You've shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you've given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Jehovah, my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I'm a little child. I do not know how to go in or how to come out or go in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you've chosen, a great people too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, to give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon asked this thing. Then God said to him, Because you've asked this thing and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your word. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you've not asked for, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes, my commandment, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Then Solomon awoke, and indeed it had been a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of Jehovah, offered up burnt offerings, offered peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Now, Solomon got off to a very, very good start as being the king of Israel. He got off to a great start. And so the people that respected him and honored him and were kind of tracking him, they saw that, okay, this guy's smart, he's wise, he's blessed by Jehovah. But Solomon doesn't really end up that way. So turn over to 1 Kings 11. 1 Kings 11 and verse 1. This is kind of the sad part when you look at how Solomon started off so strong. And then you get to 1 Kings 11, verse 1. It says, But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom Jehovah had said to the children of Israel, You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to Jehovah his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of Jehovah and did not fully follow Jehovah as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. So Jehovah became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from Jehovah, God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what Jehovah had commanded. Now, verse 11 is interesting. It says, therefore Jehovah said to Solomon. So this would be the third time that Jehovah is talking to Solomon. It says, because you've done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, for which I have chosen. Now, here's why I find that interesting. Whenever we're reading about Solomon's early life, it's all really good. But at the very end of his life, we can read the book of Ecclesiastes. And it seems like we're reading about a repentant Solomon. And yet, we're reading here that at the end of his life, he was building temples and bringing in priests, and he had done all this stuff. But here it says that God spoke to him a third time. And I'm just curious if when God speaks to you the third time and he says, here's what you've done, and I'm going to take the kingdom away, I wonder if that couldn't have possibly been the inspiration for Solomon to repent and write the book of Ecclesiastes. I don't know, pure speculation, but it seems kind of a cute thought to entertain. So let's get back to Jeroboam. Let's turn to 1 Kings 11. 1 Kings 11, and we go to verse 29. So as you see Solomon's life progress, and he's building all these temples to foreign gods, and I'm sure he's bringing in the priests from his foreign wife's countries, and he's doing all this kind of stuff. Everybody's watching. Jeroboam can see it. Everybody can see what's going on. So now in 1 Kings 11, verse 29, it says, now it happened at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite. Now, Shiloh is where the tabernacle was before the temple. And so you might say that Shiloh was HQ at the time. So here's a guy from HQ, Ahijah the Shilonite, met him on the way, and he had clothed himself with the new garment, and the two were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. And Ahijah said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel. Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and will give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city in which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. So just take note of that. So they're going to get one tribe for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem. Verse 33, because they have forsaken me and worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Shamash, the goddess of the Moabites, Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do what's right in my eyes and keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father David. However, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand because I've made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you, 10 tribes. And to his son I will give one tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself to put my name there. So I will take you, and you shall reign over all your heart's desires, and you shall be king over Israel. Then it shall be that if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes, and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. And I will afflict the descendants of David because of this, but not forever. So verse 40 says, Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam. So that's the reason, as it says, that Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So Jeroboam was a natural-born leader. He could get things done, but it was known that to Solomon that Jeroboam had been told that he was going to get the 10 tribes, because God had told Solomon in his third meeting, you're going to lose the 10 tribes, but not in your lifetime. So Solomon's, sees Jeroboam as a threat, and he is a threat. Verse 41 says, Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did in his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? The period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. So let's go to 1 Kings in chapter 12. So you can see just from what we've read so far how Jeroboam would create a picture in his mind of how God has chosen him out of all the people, and he's going to get 10 tribes, doesn't know how, doesn't know when, but this is like the picture in his mind, and that Judah is going to get Jerusalem. There's just going to be one tribe for the sake of David, for the sake of Jerusalem. This is kind of the story. So 1 Kings 12 in verse 2, So it happened when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Now this is their story. They're saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us. And remember earlier we had said that he was building the city, rebuilding Milo, and then we know that he had built all these temples and everything. So he had a lot going on. He was building a lot of stuff, and he was working everybody to death. So your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. So he said to them, Depart for 3 days and come back to me. And the people departed. So the people are tired of building temples to false gods for the sake of Solomon's wives. And, they've kind of had it up to here. Verse 6, Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived and said, How do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, If you will be a servant to these people today and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. So, good counselors, wisdom, it's the truth, it's reality. But verse 8 says that Rehoboam rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And he said to them, What advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Lighten the yoke which your father put on us? Then the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, Thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them. This was not a good thing to say. My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So the young man came up with a different story that was really more appealing to the benefit of Rehoboam than, okay, we're going to lighten the load on everybody. So verse 12, so Jeroboam And all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had directed, come back to me the third day. 13, the king answered the people roughly and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, and then he's just given them back taking the advice of the young men. Now in verse 16, it says, now when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, what share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. So Israel departed to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue. But all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Therefore King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste to flee Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Now it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him and called him to the congregation and made him king over all Israel. There was none who followed the house of David but the tribe of Judah only. Now, an interesting point here is that Jeroboam had been selected by God to be the king, but Scripture does not indicate that he was anointed king like Saul and David and Solomon were. Instead, it says that he was appointed by the congregation. Well, I got to wonder, were any of the kings of Israel anointed? And actually they were. Elijah, one of his final missions was to anoint Hazael as king over Syria and Jehu as king over Israel. So I just thought that was kind of interesting, because I had assumed that he would have been anointed king, but he wasn't. Turn to 1 Kings 12. So we saw how Solomon started out good and how he kind of went south. Now we're going to see the same thing happen to Jeroboam. 1 Kings 12 and verse 26. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Jehovah at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So this is a story that he's telling himself, right? This whole going to Jerusalem is a threat, and it really doesn't make any sense, because the only reason I don't have all the tribes is that God's preserving this one tribe for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem, and so they should just kind of have their stuff, and we've got our 10 tribes over here, we should have our stuff. So this is the story. So if these people go to, so verse number 28, therefore the king asked advice. He made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. So there's a threat, and then here's a solution. We'll just let David's house be David's house, and we'll do everything for ourselves. And he set one up in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines on the high places and made priests from every class of people who were not the sons of Levi. Now, so he did some bad stuff. Verse 32, Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made, and at Bethel he installed priests of the high places which he had made. So what possibly could have been the motivation for what Jeroboam did? What kind of stories was he telling in his mind? And how was he justifying these decisions so that it made sense to him and everybody else? Well, one, I'm just going to throw out some speculation, but I'm also going to throw out some things straight out of Scripture where we can just hook the dots up and we know exactly kind of what was going on. But it's possible that he moved the feast, the fall festival, a month later, because whenever you look at when the fall festival was, it was right before the Feast of Tabernacles. And if you kind of look at how the calendar works, the calendar shifts forward about 11 days every year. And then after it shifts far enough, then you have an interlineary month, and so then you're back to normal. So rushing the harvest would get more of a rush and more of a rush every year until you had your interlineary year, and then you would be kind of back to, okay, now we got time to do everything. So it could have been just inconvenient. But verse 33 says, so he made offerings on the altar, which he had made at Bethel, on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart, and he ordained a feast for the children of Israel and offered sacrifice on the altar and burned incense. So he's doing what he saw Solomon do a long time ago before the temple existed. He'd build an altar, made sacrifices. So what was Jeroboam buying into in order to justify these actions? So he's looking at Solomon. He says, well, why did Solomon lose the kingdom? Well, he built all these temples to foreign gods. He brought in priests. He brought in false religion. We don't want to do that. We do not want to bring in false religion. We want to only have pure religion. We're going to let David have their stuff, and then we're going to have pure religion right here. Now, how did he justify all that? Well, there's some stories in the Bible that that are really nice stories, but until I was preparing for this sermon, I didn't really hook up the dots as to why these stories were so important. So first of all, we're going to look at, we're going to ask the question, why did Jeroboam choose Dan? Why did he choose Dan? Well, we're going to find out that had been an ancient place of worship all the way back to the book of Judges, before Israel had its first king. So let's go to Judges chapter 17 and verse 1. I'm apologize if I read fast, but I've got the clock is ticking over here, and I'm going to have to speed it up. So Judges 17 in verse 1 says, now there was a man from the mountains of Ephraim whose name was Micah, and he said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and on which you put a curse, even saying it in my ears, here is the silver with me, I took it. And his mother said, well, may you be blessed by Jehovah, my son. So when he had returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to Jehovah for my son, to make a carved image and a molded image. Now therefore I will return it to you. Thus he returned the silver to his mother. Then his mother took 200 shekels of silver, gave them to the silversmith, and he made it into a carved image and a molded image, and they were in the house of Micah. Now you might be wondering, what does this have to do with Jeroboam? Well, hold on. Then the man Micah had a shrine and made an ephod and household idols, and he consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite, and he was staying there. The man departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. Then he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he journeyed. And Micah said to him, "Where do you come from?" So he said, "I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I am on my way to find a place to stay." So Micah said to him, "Dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance." So the Levite went in. And the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons to him. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, "Now I know that Jehovah will be good to me because I have a Levite as a priest." Well, it's kind of interesting that you see all the synchronism here. You've got things that obviously have nothing to do with Jehovah kind of mixed in, but they're using the name of Jehovah, and they're actually trying to worship Jehovah, but they're kind of doing it in a twisted way. Also, you'll notice that to be a priest, you have to be a Kohanim. You have to be from the line of Aaron. You can't just be a Levite. Levites weren't priests. Levites served the priest, but they had that wrong too. So let's go to look at, we're going to continue in Judges 18, verse 1. In those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in, for until that day their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. They said to them, "Go search the land." So they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. And while they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. They turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? And what are you doing in this place? And what do you have here?" He said to them, "Thus and so Micah did for me. He's hired me, and I've become his priest." So they said to him, "Please inquire of God that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The presence of Jehovah be with you on your way." So the 5 men departed and went to Laish, and they saw the people there, how they dwelt safely in the matter of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. Then the spies came back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtaol, and the brethren said to them, "What is your report?" So they said, "Arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and indeed it is very good. Would you do nothing? Do not hesitate to go and enter to possess the land. When you go, you will come to a secure people and a large land, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth." Then the 600 men of the family of the Danites went from there, from Zorah and Eshtaol, armed with weapons of war. And they went up and encamped in Kiriath Jearim in Judah, and therefore they call that place Mahane Dan to this day. There it is, west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed from there to the mountains of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the country of Laish answered and said to their brethren, "Do you know that there are in these houses an ephod, household idols, a carved image, and a molded image? Now therefore consider what you should do." So they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite, to the house of Micah, and greeted him. The 600 men armed with their weapons of war, who were of the children of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land went up. Entering there, they took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, and the molded image. The priest stood at the entrance of the gate with the 600 men who were armed with weapons of war. When these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, the molded image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Be quiet, put your hand over your mouth, and come with us. Be a father and a priest to us. It's better for you to be a priest to the household of one man, or that you be a priest to a tribe and a family in Israel." So the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod, the household idols, the carved image, and took his place among the people. Then they turned and departed, and put the little ones, the livestock, and the goods in front of them. And when they were a good way from the house of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house gathered together and overtook the children of Dan. And they came out to the children of Dan. So they turned around and said to Micah, "What ails you, that you have gathered such a company?" So he said, "You have taken away my gods which I made, and the priest, and you have gone away, and now what more do I have? How can you say to me, what ails you?" And the children of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry men fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household." Then the children of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his house. So they took the things Micah had made, and the priest who had belonged to him, and went to Laish, to a people quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. There was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no ties with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob, so they rebuilt the city and dwelt there. And they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. Then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Now, what's interesting is that in the Septuagint and the Vulgate, it reads Gershom, son of Moses. So verse 31, so they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. So looking up in some of the encyclopedias, one of the accounts of Micah's idol refers to a priest as being a sojourner there. Well, if you remember, the name Gershom means sojourner. So the accounts of Micah's idol also include reference to Jonathan, son of Gershom, as being a priest. So the rabbinic text, known as the Seder Olam, has Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, when it quotes this verse. So was it really that Gershom, or was it a different Gershom? You know, it really doesn't matter. The fact is that it makes a good story. And if you want to buy into the story, you can say, Jerusalem, they got Aaron, but here in Dan, we got Moses. We got the line of Moses, flesh and blood, right here. Also, it's interesting that many suggest that the bulls, and this is just pure speculation, I'm not saying this, I don't know, but many suggest that the bulls and calves were like the cherubim, and that God would be above the calf like God is above the cherubim in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, they get this because in Baal worship, that's one of the elements that they believe that Baal would be above the golden calf. And so, did they really believe that, or didn't they not believe it? You could say some did, some didn't. It's speculation. We don't know. But it makes a good story. And that's all we're really talking about is a story. How do they justify in their minds what they're doing? So why Dan? Well, Dan had been a place of worship since before there was a king in Israel. They had the sons of Moses, the flesh and blood descendants of Moses as priests there, and they had been worshiping there, and they had their own ephod, they had their own temple, they had everything there, and they had it for a long time. If you look at the archaeological information, they have found more archaeology in Dan to support the fact that there was a temple there, a big temple there, and a big altar there. They found all kinds of stuff in Dan, more in Dan than Bethel. So there's what's true, what's not true. They're finding pieces of the puzzle and putting it together. But if you look at Micah thought that he could have an ephod, he could have a Levite, and he could have shrines, and that he was worshiping Jehovah. Even though, we can look at that and say that's absurd, but that's the story. So you can say that was the culture around that area. You also notice that in Dan, who did they wipe out? They wiped out the Sidonians, right? Well, if you remember who Ahab's wife was Jezebel, who was a Sidonian princess, totally committed to Baal worship. And so they wiped out this place that probably already had some calves and stuff around. Who knows? Did they, didn't they? I don't know. Makes a good story, though. So now we know kind of how you can build a story around Dan, how you can justify Dan. We've been worshiping in Dan. We've been sacrificing in Dan. We've had a temple in Dan since before Saul was king. So you can kind of see that. So now we'll ask the question, why Bethel? So this place, Bethel, is mentioned way back in the time of Abraham, even before an actual city existed. We're going to pick up the story of Jacob because Jacob kind of made it famous. So if you go to Genesis 28, in verse 10, says, now Jacob went out of Beersheba and went towards Haran. This is when he's running away from his brother. And he's headed to Syria so that his brother doesn't kill him. Verse 11, so he came to a certain place and stayed there all night because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up from the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, Jehovah stood above it and said, I am Jehovah, God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely Jehovah is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. Now, house of God is Bethel, and this is the gate of heaven. Then Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put at his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city had been Luz previously. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way, that I'm going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then Jehovah shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up as a pillar, shall be God's house, Bethel. And of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. A scripture, I'm going to read Genesis 31:13, just a quick one scripture where God is talking to Jacob, and it says, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to be. Now arise, get out of the land, and return to the land of your family. So now let's go to Genesis 35. Genesis 35 and verse 1, and continue to look at the story behind why Jeroboam would choose Bethel. So Genesis 35 and verse 1 says, then God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God. So Jacob's in Syria, and he's leaving. Make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. Verse 2, and Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, Put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourself, and change your garments. And let us arise and go up to Bethel. Let us go up to the house of Jehovah. And I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me in the way in which I have gone. Now, I never, before I prepared for this sermon, I never really connected the fact that they were getting rid of the gods. I thought at one time they're getting rid of gods and all the foreign stuff because they're going to go see his parents. They're going to go back, to where he lived, and you can't have all this pagan stuff around you. But I never really hooked it up to the location. They're going to the house of God, to Bethel. They've got to get rid of they've got to be pure. And so that's kind of what they were doing. And so verse 4, they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, the earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree which was by Shechem. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. Now, so El Bethel is God, house of God. Now, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree, so the name of it was called Elon Bukuth. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. So, and verse 10, and God said to him, your name is Jacob, your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. Also God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I give to you and your descendants after you, I give this land. Then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke to him, Bethel, house of God. So can you see how Jeroboam would be thinking, we've got the house of God right here in Israel. We don't need Jerusalem. We don't need all their pagan temples. We don't need, we don't need that connection, because we've got our own stuff. Let's turn over to Judges 21. Judges 21 and verse 19. I'm going to just mention Saul a little bit, because Saul has to do with Bethel as well. So Judges 21 and verse 9. Then they said, in fact, there's a yearly feast of Jehovah in Shiloh, which is north of Bethel. They're kind of like neighboring cities, on the east side of the highway that goes from Bethel to Shechem and south of Lebonah. So they had the Feast of Tabernacles there. In 1 Samuel 10 and verse 1. 1 Samuel 10 and verse 1. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him and said, is it not because Jehovah has anointed you commander over his inheritance? When you've departed from me today, you will find 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah, and they will say to you, the donkeys which you went to look for have been found. That brings to mind the story of how Saul became king. And now your father has ceased caring about the donkeys and is worrying about you, saying, what shall I do about my son? Verse 3, then you shall go on forward from there and come to the terebinth tree of Tabor. There are 3 men going up to God at Bethel, which means house of God, will meet you, one carrying 3 young goats, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a skin of wine. And so then you can see that, okay, well, this is, there's so many religious related things that are connected to Bethel, including the name, which is house of God. So the Bethel had history with Abraham, It had history with Jacob, Israel, and with Saul, and all the history was kind of known. So now we're going to flip back to Jeroboam. So let's go to 1 Kings 13. Going to finish up with Jeroboam's sad story. 1 Kings 13 and verse 1. And behold, a man of God went from Judah to Bethel by the word of Jehovah, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. And then he cried out against the altar by the word of Jehovah and said, O altar, altar, thus says Jehovah, behold, a child by Josiah's name shall be born to the house of David, and on you he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and the men's bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign which Jehovah has spoken. Surely the altar shall split apart, and the ashes on it shall be poured out. And so it came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, who cried out against the altar in Bethel, that he stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, Arrest him. And then his hand which he stretched out toward him withered, so that he couldn't pull it back. Verse 5, the altar also was split apart, and ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of Jehovah. Then the king answered and said to the man of God, Please entreat the favor of Jehovah your God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored to me. So the man of God entreated Jehovah, and the king's hand was restored and became as before. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that it says, please entreat the favor of Jehovah your God. Not my God, that's your God. So you can see how things had kind of deteriorated there. Verse 7, then the king said to the man of God, Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward. But the man of God said to the king, If you were to give me half your house, I would not go with you, nor would I eat bread nor drink water in this place. For so it was commanded me by the word of Jehovah, saying, You shall not eat bread nor drink water, nor return by the same way you came. So he went another way and did not return by the way he came to Bethel. And then there's kind of a sad story associated with this, where an old prophet, it mentions it in verse 11, begins the story. An old prophet dwelt in Bethel, and his sons came and told him all the works that the man of God that had done that day in Bethel. They also told their father which the words had spoken to the king. So that prophet, you can read that story yourself. We don't have time to go through it, but he kind of tricked the true prophet into coming back to Bethel, and it wasn't a good situation. 1 Kings 13. 1 Kings 13, verse 33 and 34. It says, After this event, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but again he made priests from every class of people for the high places, whoever wished. He consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. And this thing was the sin of the house of Jeroboam, so as to exterminate and destroy from the face of the earth. So now let's go to 1 Kings 14, another story. I mean, Jeroboam had so many chances, but what was he thinking? What was he telling himself? So in 1 Kings 14, verse 1, at the time Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, became sick. And then Jeroboam said to his wife, Please arise, disguise yourself, that they may not recognize you as the wife of Jeroboam, and go to Shiloh. And indeed, Ahijah, the prophet who is there, who told me that I would be king over this people. So gives his wife instructions to go see Abijah. Now let's go down to verse 7. This is what Abijah is telling her. Go tell Jeroboam, Thus says Jehovah, God of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people and made you ruler over my people, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And yet you have not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments and who followed me with all his heart, to do only what was right in my eyes. But you've done more evil than all who were before you. For you've gone and made for yourself other gods and molded images to provoke me to anger, and have cast me behind your back. Therefore, behold, I will bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam every male in Israel, bond and free. I will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam as one takes away refuse until it is all gone. The dog shall eat whoever belongs to Jeroboam and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the field, for Jehovah has spoken. Therefore go to your own house. When your feet enter the city, the child shall die. And all Israel shall mourn for him and bury him, for he is the only one of Jeroboam who shall come to the grave, because in him there is found something good towards Jehovah, God of Israel, in the house of Jeroboam. Now, verse 13 I find pretty interesting. I'm going to have to dig into that, because it says that he's the only one who shall come to the grave, come to Sheol, because in him there is found something good toward Jehovah, God of Israel. Verse 14, moreover, Jehovah will raise up for himself a king over Israel, who shall cut off the house of Jeroboam. This is the way, this is the day, what, even now. So Jeroboam is got kind of a bad ending too. And it says in verse 20, it ends up with the period that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years, so he rested with his fathers. Then Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. So, brethren, when you look at what Jeroboam did, okay, he didn't want the people to go to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, why would he not want that? Well, he questioned their loyalty. You know, could they go there and be loyal to him? In his mind, in his story, no, they couldn't do that. Another thing to consider is there were 3 pilgrimage feasts a year, and in those pilgrimage feasts, that's when they brought their tithes to the temple. So they had 10% of their harvest, 10% of their animals, 10% of everything that they would tithe on that they took to the temple. Well, when you've got that much goods leaving your country, leaving the 10 tribes and going to the one tribe, that would be a reason why you say, okay, something's not quite right with that. You know, we need to keep those tithes here. The only way that you can keep those tithes here is and within the 10 tribes, is to keep the festivals here within the 10 tribes. Another thing to consider is that Dan was 200 miles away from Jerusalem. So now we think of 200 miles and we go, okay, I can probably drive that in 4 hours. But if you're taking cartfuls of your tithes, your grains or your harvest, whether it's in the fall festival, I guess that would be grapes and figs and stuff like that. But if you're taking carts of produce and you're driving 10% of your animals, then you're not going to be traveling really fast. You're going to be going slow. So to go 200 miles could take 3 weeks. It could take 4 weeks. So then you go a 3-week trip there. Well, then you're there 10 days, and then you got 3 weeks back. So you got more than 2 months to make this trek. So it's really, really inconvenient because it's so far away. So I mean, we've got our own place in Dan. We've been practicing worship here for years and years. So you can see how people could tell the story. Another thing to consider is that at the time that Jeroboam was alive, you had the Torah was written, but that was kind of all that they had access to. And the job of the Levites was to be teachers. But if you kick all the Levites out of the country, or you de-elevate them. They may be some in the country, but you de-elevate them where they're no longer doing their job as a teacher, not teaching Torah. Well, then the accuracy of thinking, the accuracy of what God's will just tanks. Well, then the synchronism can creep in really easily because you don't have somebody that's educated telling the truth, helping you through all this kind of stuff. So, brethren, in conclusion, the most dangerous stories are the ones that we make up. The ones where we're looking at our habits, we're looking at our attitudes, we're looking at our beliefs, we're looking at our expectations, and our point of view represents truth. It represents sanity. Everything else has got to be false. Except we're dealing with a carnal mind. We're dealing with deception. We're dealing with scotomas and blind spots and opinions and authority figures that have told us things that weren't true. And so we've got all this head trash going on. And so we can't just assume that we know the truth. We have to search for the truth. And we have to search our own heart, our own thoughts, our own attitudes and beliefs, and ask the question, is it the truth? And we say, could I have a blind spot? Because if you say, okay, I could have a blind spot, now all of a sudden you're trying to look through the blind spot. So turn over to Romans 15 and verse 4. Romans 15 and verse 4. Romans 15 verse 4. For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. 1 Corinthians 10, another little quick scripture you're familiar with, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 11 says, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So, brethren, you know, I had looked at some of these stories in the Old Testament about, you know, the shrine at Dan and Micah and all that, and I thought they were kind of interesting reading, but I never really hooked together that history is important to answer the question of why Dan. And then you look at the name Bethel, it means house of God. That's a pretty big deal. It had a lot of history. So there's a lot of reason why that could be built into a story to justify what you think you need to do to keep your country secure, to keep the money in the country, and to keep all that from leaving. Last scripture, brethren, is Psalms 119 and verse 18. Psalms 119 in verse 18. Let's start with verse 17. 119 verse 17, deal bountifully with your servant, that I may live and keep your word. Open my eyes, that I may see the wondrous things of your law. Brethren, we have to pray that Yehovah will open our eyes, and we can see through our blind spots. We can see through our preconceived notions. We can see through incorrect things that we may have been taught, and really search for the truth and depend on Yehovah to open our eyes and to give us the vision.